Engage.
This is, excuse me, a damn fine cup of coffee.
I am the one who knocks.
Hi, I'm Jessica Richards.
I'm Ashley Zanter.
And I'm Scott Nielsen.
And this is UniversiTV. This week, we're going to be talking about Santa Clarita Diet, which dropped in February of this year. It's a really interesting show. It has some zombies in it. I just wanted to read a brief summary to let everybody kind of know about the show a little bit. The Hammonds are a normal family. They're real estate agents, and when the show begins, their biggest problem is selling homes for above asking. In the first episode, Sheila Hammond, played by Drew Barrymore, contracts a strange disease which makes her crave human flesh. Rather than seek help and have their family torn apart, her husband, Joel Hammond, played by an excellent Timothy Olyphant, agrees to feed her nasty new habit by killing their neighbors, criminals, and generally annoying people. So, this is the first show that we're talking about on UniversiTV, and so I kind of wanted to get your feedback, like, why do you think this show merits discussion? Like, why do you think it's important?
So I think it sort of exists in this weird limbo space because it's a comedic take on zombies, which we've seen before, right? iZombie's kind of funny, and we exist, like Warm Bodies was a little bit of a comedy. So it's not a departure or anything like that, but it sort of exists in this weird space of like, you're a zombie, but you're kind of not a zombie. And it's just dealing with it in a different realm. And also as the first like original zombie streaming on Netflix. Right. I think it's sort of like, a Netflix original always gets a lot of attention. And so this is going to get a lot of attention as a pretty prime property for them. They did a lot of advertising, so.
Well, and it's interesting because, like, it does depart from what we normally consider to be, like, the generic zombie tropes, right? There's no horde. There's no apocalyptic scenario. The government is still around. This is just a family kind of dealing with their own personal crisis of the mom really just wanting to eat everyone, which is really awkward, right?
So it seems like my unpopular opinion is that I really like the show. And I say that because it seems like a lot of the people I talk to tend to have negative reactions towards it. They watched the first episode and it was too gory or too gross. And so they just pieced out of that. They didn't want to watch it. So they didn't keep going, where the show does take several episodes to get its footing. And that's ironic if you've seen it because feet. But but it takes a little while to get there, but when it gets there, I think that it hits some really important notes. And so even though the beginning and the ending are, like, admittedly unsatisfying for most viewers, I think, because of how they leave it hanging, how they open it with, like, just really lots of blood, lots of vomit, lots of bodily fluids just everywhere.
So many
bodily fluids. I think it's really hard to, like, catch the viewership, but episodes, like, 4 through 6 are stellar. And so I think that kind of trajectory is really interesting, especially for a Netflix original.
Right, but that's only 3 episodes out of the 10 that dropped.
Well, and I think I kind of had a similar kind of feedback loop that Ashley did, where I was like, hey, have you watched Santa Clarita Diet? What did you think? And people are like, oh, I hated it. And I was like, how much did you watch? Like 15 minutes. And it seems like if people can get through those first few episodes, it gets better. And it has some valuable things. There are obviously a lot of like uncomfortable, like gory moments. But I think what's really interesting about those is like there's the vomit scene with Drew Barrymore in the open house. And it's excessive. It's honestly, I mean, it's hilarious, but it's also disgusting. And I think one thing that differs in this show from typical zombie properties is that it's disgusting, but it goes so far that it becomes funny. Mm-hmm. And it sort of says like, hey, this is disgusting, but we're just going to have you accept this.
Well, and for me, it's kind of interesting because that's one of the problems that I have with it in terms of how it addresses issues just over the course of the story, right? How probable does this feel in terms of, like, the comedy, of course, is supposed to be extreme, but it borders on absurd. I mean, it goes way past absurd. It's super absurd. The whole premise that this is a family that's, like, willing to kill together, to stay together, just to me, like, I can't I don't buy it. And
That's the plot of like every horror movie.
Yeah.
The
family that kills together stays together.
I mean, that's the whole premise of The Walking Dead. That's the whole premise of Breaking Bad. Like, that's the whole premise of a lot of shows where people are killing to protect their family. That doesn't seem quite. I mean, that's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That's what all of these things are.
Right,
it's people killing to protect their
Luckily,
family.
there's less inbreeding in this show.
But most of those shows like track a progression, right? Walter White doesn't start that way. He gets there over the course of seasons of television where he slowly escalates from that. These guys go 0 to 60 and they do it in an episode. And it's sort of shocking. And that's partly what I want to talk about is a little bit is like, for me, this show doesn't really work unless it's a metaphor for something. I wonder if they're trying to play with these ideas of like how complicit we are in experiencing trauma from the middle class. It's like, okay, so we don't actually witness trauma on a daily basis, or do we participate in conflicts in the same ways that you normally would expect. But in fact, as we participate in these kinds of structures and systems that oppress other people, we are enacting this kind of violence on a daily basis. I mean, so for me, that's really where the show succeeds, is it brings that horror right into the domestic sphere and makes us look at it. And that really creeps me out.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think so much of what I appreciate about the show, right, is its normalization, simplification of these horrific acts, where it's sort of like, for me, the first episode is a lot of them kind of, here, witty repartee, like, here's my clever joke that's not really that clever. And so I think kind of falls flat. But then what I really love is they get into this sort of, hey, honey, how was his liver? Like, did it taste good? Do we need a new recipe? Like, such simple, just day-to-day husband-wife talk about the most horrific things. And I think that's brilliant. And I think that speaks to like the desensitization that you talked about, right? We take these horrors and eventually, and I think what's brilliant about the show is that it does it to its viewer, that you are horrified at the beginning and by the end you're like, yeah, how is she going to eat his entire body? Like, that's going to be horrific. She's going to be on the toilet all night. It's going to be disgusting.
So much protein.
Like, she's on an Atkins diet.
Man.
And it really gets you into that same space, which I think is absolutely brilliant. And I think it speaks a lot to like what we're willing to do when it becomes like, okay, normal is no longer an option. What are you willing to do to get back to normal?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, and like I'm not disagreeing with your Marxist reading of this so far. The idea that it's economic horror, it's the experience of the middle class in the 21st century. I more looked at it, especially because of how Drew Barrymore's character Sheila is the one who terrible performance. By the way, terrible.
What happened to you? You used to be good. You were an ET. Charlie's Angels was the best.
Oh, dear God. So, no, but I think because she's the central figure, because she's the zombie figure, and because the only other zombification happens to Loki, the large black man in the show, and because of how the zombification changes him from the person he was, we see at the beginning, to the person we see at the end, post-zombie whatever, I really saw it more as a metaphor for like the female experience in 21st century America. So that's how I more read it, like the horror of being female. And so a lot of the reason why it seems so gory is because she's the one doing the gore, I would argue. I mean, she's the one doing the killing. She's the one being violent. She's the one taking violent action. And we're not used to seeing a tiny blonde woman kill a man with her bare hands. And that makes us deeply uncomfortable to the point where it becomes absurdist comedy.
Right. Well, and I think it speaks to sort of like this sexual awakening that she experiences. And if you think about like, the plight of women who are awakened sexually or experience this sort of sexual vigor are monsters, right? They voraciously consume men because I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they only kill men. I don't think a single woman has died in the show.
Not so far.
Right. But I it's actually really interesting because kind of going back with that normalization thing, like, Drew Barrymore has the libido of like a 17-year-old boy, and it's ridiculous.
Well, and super gross because she's super dead.
Yeah.
Her body oozes black goo. Her eyeball falls out of her head.
Her toe falls off.
Breaks off.
And Timothy Oliphant, bless his heart, just goes with it. Like, you're a trooper.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the other things. I think his performance in this really makes it. I think without him, it would be...
His comedic timing is absolutely beautiful. Oh, yeah. And I was reading an article that said that, like, the author personally believed that the reason why his performance is so perfect, so comedically perfect, his timing is beautiful, is because he just came off of Justified, where he did, like, heavy, violent, dark scenes for six or something seasons. Yeah. And now he's on this show where he gets to yell curse words and be upset and walk around flailing his arms. And
he was a little slow to start, I think, but by the time when he starts having his own sort of awakening, really coming around to her way of thinking, like, he's just a gem. There are like 3 or 4 lines in there that are the funniest things I've seen on TV. See, Mormons are helpful. So I would give Timothy Oliphant anything. I would just be like, cool, whatever you want. Yeah, I'll shine your shoes, give you a back rub. You can sell me for parts.
Well, and interestingly, right, this show is not your typical zombie show, right? It does not fit in to the zombies on television history that the things we're used to seeing, we do not see in the show.
No, not at all. What you normally think of is the stuff on The Walking Dead where, it's the humans versus this other group of people. There are some elements that are the same. There's like a contagion anxiety that's present in this show. There's the death and decay stuff within the domestic sphere that's like really bracing. And there's even some terminal illness stuff that kind of reminds me of pieces of what we've inherited from different zombie stuff over the course of time. But I think it's interesting because it sort of takes it all a step further. I mean, part of the problem that I have with it is that nobody's really sad about what's happening. Mm-hmm. There are some moments where they like try and express some degree of grief, but it ends up being kind of funny.
Yeah.
And there are no moments of poignancy within this narrative. They are rapid fire moving from space to space. And I don't know if that's sustainable for a comedy. I guess a certain kind of comedy, a situation comedy, that makes sense. But for me, a lot of that stuff didn't land. And I think partly, it was really affected by Drew Barrymore's performance because I didn't buy her as a caring mom. Everything she said just sounded really false.
I didn't buy her as a person.
Yeah. It was like...
She's kind of the perfect Californian, though.
Well, and that's the part that, I kind of want to get at a little bit here is like, why is it so fake? What are they trying to do in that way that they sort of are replicating or sort of mirroring or trying to talk about these things? But is that intentional or was it just a bad performance?
I don't know. I think the fake thing, like, it just doesn't seem like an authentic performance. It doesn't seem like every time she's talking with her girlfriends and walking and being like, well, I just feel so great. And so it's like, do you? Or are you just sort of reading lines off at this point? I don't actually buy anything you're saying, but I buy all the people around you reacting to it.
Right.
And so I think she's saved by a better cast existing around her, but she's the least interesting part of the show. And she's the central focus.
Right. Well, and the fact that there's a hole where a woman is supposed to be. Like, is that the point of the show, though?
I mean, I guess it kind of fits in if you're thinking about zombies on TV right now. If you look at iZombie, which is like the closest thing in my mind that I can think of to this show that exists in the television sphere, at least, right? Because you've got some film equivalents, but in the television sphere, we've got very specific zombie narratives. You got The Walking Dead, which has literally nothing to do with the zombies. They show up once in a blue moon. People are like, oh, right, apocalypse.
Plot
we
device.
Forgot. Exactly. They come in when someone's life needs to be put in danger, and then the rest of the time, they're like a non-issue, which is just a whole other can of worms unto itself. But in terms of the female zombie as empty vessel space, iZombie really fits into that because of how she assumes other personalities over the course of the show. So we never really know who she is as a person. And so I think it's really interesting that what Santa Clarita Diet is doing is picking up on that tradition, but without replacing it with the iZombie gimmick of new personalities that she's trying on. She just doesn't have one.
Right.
Yeah. It's actually really interesting, I think, if you look back, origins of zombies, right? Voodoo, hoodoo, like, cool, let's basically make a person that's bound to me, that's my slave. We've had this tradition of mindless zombies, slosh around, are basically controlled by the id. And they play on that in this, but functionally, and very similar to like kind of iZombie, it's like, these are zombies that have free will. They talk about they feel more alive than when they were actually living, which has some sort of weird commentary of like, oh, we're all on our phones. We're not actually living. Like, millennials are the worst. And I wonder how well that works. Because, like, I get it. You weren't living until you acted upon your id, which is what Timothy Oliphant's character has, that same arc of like, great, I really wanted to kill this guy and I did it, so now I have erections again, so great.
Well, and this is sort of segues into my point. Like, I think that what this show is ultimately talking about is the experience of femininity in 21st century culture. So we equate zombiness with foreignness. It's the other that is not us. When there's an us and them, they're always the them. Sure. And so what I think is happening here is we're tending to use the zombie increasingly, especially with all these zombie women that we're starting to see. Zombie women is an exploration of what does it mean to be feminine, and why is it that, like, as soon as they become a zombie, their sexuality spikes up. They're allowed to be more adventurous. They're allowed to be more active. They're allowed to be bolder and more outspoken. That's what she says when she opens the show, right? She's like, I wish I were bolder. Yeah. And so this is the thing that allows her to be bolder. But like the juxtaposition in the show between what it is to be a zombie and what it is to be a woman is really uncomfortable, but I think a very interesting conversation to have. Because if when you're identifying as female or as feminine, what you're identifying with is otherness, that brings up a whole host of things.
Well, and I think there's something to be said about the fact that she can't control her body, which is a fundamentally female experience, right? Those notions of not really having control, and even current discussions about how that control is legislated, how we don't even have choices about that. I think that that's certainly very relevant to that kind of discussion about how women take up space. But there are also women in the show that I think contradict that or problematize it. I mean, I think of Portia de Rossi's character, who's very masculine and very interesting. I think she was one of my favorite pieces of the show. I always love Portia.
But a mocked outsider nonetheless.
Right. And who doesn't have connection to, isn't capable of emotion, right? There's that whole sequence where she's trying to figure out how to hug Drew Barrymore's character, right?
Well, it's actually interesting. Like, all of the women kind of exist in this realm. You've got sort of the adulterous wife who's kind of a horrible person, you know, and then you've got the hyper-aggressive male who's just a huge asshole, right? And I feel like all of the men and women, with the exception of, like, Eric, they kind of fit into that same archetype, like hyper-aggressive, like, yeah, I'm going to get that, and enforce my will upon another one, right? Pure masculine patriarchy right there, right? And all of the women are sort of like, we're repressed, so we want to do nefarious things. And it's sort of like Timothy Oliphant's like, cool, I'm going to kill people. And Drew Barry's like, I'm going to live my life to the fullest, right? So kind of act as like the ultimate extreme that these people are all aspiring to.
What do you think of the mythological element in the show? Like, they have this whole Polish narrative. Right. What is Serbian. That even about? Serbian.
It's super weird. In terms of zombie mythology, there's not a whole lot of that. And I only say that because in world mythologies, a lot of zombie myths that involve supernatural elements tend to be very closely linked with vampire myths. Right. So like there's the Jiangxi in China, which is sort of half vampire, half zombie. We're not sure what it is. It drinks your blood, but it also walks really stiffly, like it's rigor mortis-y, like zombies walk, right? And so we have a lot of these mythologies that come to us, but the trend since Romero's Night of the Living Dead, 1968, is for this sort of sickness, this outbreak, something, and then 28 Days Later got us to it with the viral Walking Dead's very much operating on the fact that there's some kind of disease in the air that makes us all the living dead. And so I thought it was particularly interesting that this show chose to go, like, they took a hard left away from all of that, and they're like, not only is it not probably contagion, because all the times they try to approach it as a sickness or an illness or a virus, nothing ever really gets figured out. But then there's this Serbian village with a book that has a weird title, and then the principal is Serbian, whose grandmother also just knows Serbian because there's just Serbians everywhere apparently. And so I thought that was particularly interesting, and I also thought it was interesting that they chose to leave that totally open-ended.
Right. We don't have any answers at this point. She's locked in the garage and he is in the insane asylum, which I actually thought was a very nice reversal. For the first time at the end of a show, it is not the woman who is carted away to an asylum, but the man. Right. So
you're
so
the crazy
refreshing.
One.
Yes, right. It was like,
and she's just chained up in the basement.
Right, because she's become bestial, right? Yeah. So I do think that there's some really interesting subversive stuff happening in the show.
Sure. I worry a little bit with the whole Serbian thing, because that sort of, I think it was sort of like, okay, kind of like when you have the mystical Orient, kind of like, oh, you're kind of like the superstitious Eastern Europeans, right? Like Romanians are all vampires and witches, and the Serbians are all zombies. I think the comedy and tone of the show doesn't take it seriously, so it's not like cultural appropriation or anything like that. But it was one of those situations like, great, Serbians drink and deal with old magic. Cool. Awesome.
Speaking as a Hungarian American, it's 100% accurate. Yeah. No, I think there is a lot of stigma there. We talk about like the old country, the old world, but I think that, and I hate to sound like that person, a lot of that comes from stuff that still exists back there. There are a lot of Eastern European cultures that still genuinely believe that vampires are a thing that they need to guard themselves against. And so I also think that it's interesting that what the show seems to be doing, even though it's a comedy, is it's taking some of that seriously. In a way where it's like, yeah, there was a whole village, and the village had such a terrible experience that the oral tradition was passed down from parent to child to parent to child. And then we see it in the grandmother, where she's like, this was our boogeyman story. Yeah. And I remember my grandmother talking about things like that, and she was born and raised in Hungary, so.
Right. I mean, yeah, I remember watching a YouTube video my girlfriend showed me about these Romanian witches, and like the way they talked about it and interacted with it, and you just think these people are out of their mind. Like they're doing curses and potions, but they absolutely, it's like, no, people, this is a business. People Facebook me for this stuff.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting thing, the ways in which sort of they incorporate. And partly one of the things that disturbed me or was a little bit frustrating is how they portray nerd culture in this show. Yeah. Right? It's kind of insulting, the degrees to which not only are the nerds, so for people who have been watching, there's this section where they end up going to this sort of con where they're trying to get information about the book so that they can figure out how to save Sheila, from Drew Barrymore's character, from certain death and from having to kill more people because it's fairly inconvenient. So they're trying to do all this different stuff, and they end up showing these people at this con who have no social skills, who are making stuff up. Right?
They're all dudes.
And they're all dudes. And I was a little irritated by that personally, because I think the people that are involved in this kind of mythos and this kind of stuff aren't going to be taken in by that, you know? And I found that to be a little bit irritating. So it was kind of frustrating that like a show that is so aware of its roots. I mean, they spend a lot of time laying out, oh, here's how this intersects with zombieism, here's how all this stuff goes, that then sort of like slights the nerds all the way through. And I don't know if it's just because they have such good looking people in the show that they had to point that out. I'm not sure, but it was really irritating to me.
So I wonder who this show's for. Like ultimately, like if you said like, because a lot of times you say like, oh cool, this is for boys age 18 to 35. This is for women age 40 to 50, right? But like, so we got like sex, we've got zombies, we've got nerds. So, I mean, is this for like the frat boy? Is this for nerds and saying like, hey, we're going to poke jabs at you, but we're going to make zombies sexy? I don't know. Like, I don't know who it's for.
Right. Well, and I think that that's part of the problem. What ends up happening is like the market is kind of saturated. People are trying to create more spaces. And one of the things that a lot of people have recognized about the zombie genre is that it doesn't really reach women. So we keep trying. We keep trying to reach the women through the zombie genre in order to tap into that marketplace. This is where you get like Warm Bodies and Pride and Prejudice and zombies. And you get all these kinds of shows that are like, hey, we have a very religious set of guys who come to these every single time. How do we tap into that female market? How do we make that a thing? And what ends up happening usually is that it splits the difference. So the guys are like, yeah, that doesn't have enough zombies in it. And the girls are like, yeah, and that was really gross. Right. And so it doesn't really end up satisfying anyone. Well, it's hard at least so far, I don't think.
I mean, speaking as someone who doesn't have ovaries, does the idea of like becoming a zombie and becoming empowered by that, is that even appealing? Because for me, that's not a good trade-off. I'll take a little bit of oppression for a heartbeat.
I'm not sure that I would describe it as appealing, but in zombie things where women become the zombies, there always seems to be a libido increase. And so you could say that that's just a result of the id taking over, right? It wants sex, it will have sex. So you could look at it that way, but if you look at Burying the X, if you look at Life After Beth, if you look at iZombie, there always seems to be this libidinous increase when a woman becomes a zombie. And I'm not sure why that is, because in zombie things where men become zombies, that's not necessarily true, except in the like iZombie television show where she's a zombie, but there's also sexy male zombies, and the sexy male zombies and the sexy female zombies have sexy zombie sex. So, I mean, there are those instances.
That's the new name of my band, Sexy Zombie Sex.
You can have that one.
Thank you.
That's a freebie.
Well, you're going to be in the band.
Oh, excellent.
You're going to be on guitar. It's going to be that kind
terrible.
of band.
Okay, no, but there is this, and I wonder why that is. If it's just like a freeing experience, it's the same thing that happens when women become vampires. They become much more sexually active, sexually aggressive.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if this is just tapping into sort of like that vampiric supernatural tradition where it's like, well, she's a monstrous other, so she might as well be banging someone.
Right. Well, I mean, like, ever since, like, I mean, Bram Stoker's Dracula kind of took it in that direction, didn't it? Though, like, the idea of, like, Dracula was, like, this sort of sexually seductive, like, lead you into this, like, we're going to trap you, don't be attracted. And they've kind of kept with that tradition. And monstrous vampires, you don't see a whole lot. But, like, I wonder, because with women who are zombies, right, like you said, their libido increases, they become sort of sexually voracious. But male zombies, they just eat you. Mm-hmm. Right? They consume, they take in. It's sort of like you're not a part of that. And I wonder if that's commentary or like how we view women versus how we view men.
Sexually aggressive women are monsters.
Right, exactly, right? And men, when they just seek to consume and take you in and you get the shit end of the deal. So literally.
Well, I think too, it's really liberating to think about potentially how dangerous women can be. I think a lot of times our actions are framed as inconsequential. And I think that having somebody who has control over life and death of another human being at any given moment and sort of reminding of us that to us the whole time really is an important part of the genre and a part of what this show seems to be kind of doing. I think one of my favorite scenes in the whole show is that at the very early bit where they're trying to drag the body of the man that she's eaten in the backyard all the way into the pit.
Nathan Fillion.
Yeah, when they're trying to eat, which was so sad because he appeared and I was like,
He's
Nathan
basically,
Fillion is in this?
If Captain Hammer was a real estate agent, that's who his character is in this show.
He was terrible. And so she ate him, and they're trying to clean up the mess and they have this massive fight over where the lid is. And there's saran wrap over the top of the thing, and they're trying to pull it along, and he's like, where's the lid? I think that was one of my favorite discussions. It highlighted the absurdity of it, but it also, again, it sort of takes the domestic sphere and it turns it into this really violent, really destructive place. And so I think it's kind of scary in that way,
Well, along those same line, I think my favorite little sub fight that they had is, how would you kill me? It's like, I'd bash your brains in with a baseball bat. And it's like the fight that ensues.
Where did that come from?
Right, just this idea that, like...
You must be angry.
Like, yeah, like, that it's a fight. It feels like it's a fight that no couple has probably ever had. I hope. If you have, please call us. We'll get you help. But that it just felt like a real fight.
Yeah,
like,
in a lot of ways.
It was just like, these are all it's like, if you had this fight, these are all the touch points that a real husband and wife would have. Like, well, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you make it beautiful? Like, you lay me down and you just very slowly shove a knife in my brain.
Well, and I wonder if maybe that's part of what made viewing this so uncomfortable. Like, as someone who grew up near Santa Clarita, I'm familiar with what it means to be a part of a middle-class white family in Southern California. Like, that's an experience that is very real for me in that it was my upbringing. So I'm wondering if that's part of the, I don't want to call it uncanniness of it, but like the discomfort that maybe some people are experiencing when they're watching it. Is like, if this is about economic violence, if this is about domestic struggle, if this is about how difficult it is to be middle class and to navigate that kind of life in 2017, if maybe it's just too close to home for some people, where like it's not funny enough to transcend that, but it's not dark enough for you to delve deep into it.
Right, it's that middle space. And so so I think that this show's doing a lot of different stuff. If you were going to give it a grade, what would you give it?
I'd give it a B+.
A B+?
That's tough. I'd probably give it a B or a C+. I'm going to stick with B because I ended liking it. Right. But if I started, I'd give it an F. So I'm going to settle with B.
Oh, wow. No, I think I kind of sit in that same space. I think that that's kind of where I'm the most comfortable. I think B plus. That's kind of I thought there was some really unique and really original stuff in this show, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Well, I loved how seriously it took adolescence.
Yeah.
Abby, the daughter's character, she's dealing with some shit, you know? And your mother's a zombie. And so I think how they portrayed her as she's not ridiculous. She's not trivial. She's not like your typical teenage girl archetype. She's smart and she's resourceful. She's not great at school. She's got character depth. I thought she was really well done. And so what I'm hoping is if they do greenlight a second season for this, my B plus will be able to go up because of the different things that they do with those kinds of characters, how they take her more seriously, how they take teenage boys seriously. Usually we make fun of teenage boys so quickly, but I thought Eric was a fairly fascinating character dealing with an abusive stepdad.
I feel like everyone's kind of okay with the death of their stepdad for a time.
Oh, Lord.
Mom, I didn't mean that. Anyway, but yeah, it's sort of like this idea of this is an abuse that you suffered and you see their cold, dead body and it's like, what do you do? And he's sort of, he tells him off. Mm-hmm. But that moment was a little hollow for me because I was like, I wish he'd done it when he was alive.
Yeah.
You know, I wish there could have been something that you wanted that moment, but also it's probably a moment that couldn't have happened, right? It's like that's the kind of kid who he'd have to be dead to be able to say that to his
Well,
stepdad.
and I think too that there's a point, there's some degree with that character, the stepfather character, that he's not going to let anybody say anything to him, So I don't think it's like. So this is the moment he can have him where he sits still for just a second so he can finally tell him off, right? Sure. So I did think that, generally they're pretty irresponsible. They're throwing tear gas into various locations. And
oh, come on. That's not what you were doing at 16?
Ripping off people
tear gassing neighbors.
I was more of a fan of the anthrax myself, but Homeland Security shut that down.
Yeah, so, there are some things about that. Again, it comes back to that sort of absurdism. And again, the horror of adolescence and of growing up and realizing that your parents aren't going to be there forever and how you're going to deal with that. Those are all some things that I think that the show kind of touches on. So the last thing I kind of want to do today to sort of wrap this up is talk about what you're watching this week. What other stuff are you on?
Well, when I take breaks from my large viewings of anime, I watch more anime, and then I read some manga, and then I watch some more anime. No, I think right now, specifically, I've been watching Lucifer.
Okay.
It's interesting. I'm a big fan of the Neil Gaiman Lucifer series, Sandman, the whole comic anthology, and I think it's an interesting show that I wouldn't say is necessarily great or good, even good, but it's interesting, and I think it's a topic of discussion for another time.
I love Lucifer. I'm right there. I've been hanging on to that. But what I'm actually watching Preacher. Preacher is on AMC, same network as The Walking Dead, but way better than The Walking Dead, which you'll get to know soon. I hate. But no, Preacher's really interesting. So it's a show based on a graphic novel from DC Comics, the Vertigo imprint of DC Comics. And it was created by Seth Rogen. And Sam Catlin, I think, is the other one. I think I said his name right. But I was really shocked that, because Seth Rogen usually does one thing, and that's variations on Pineapple Express. But this is really interesting. It's based on a graphic novel that's known for how violent and gory and bloody it is. So when Seth Rogen was attached to the project, people were a little weirded out by it. But it's about a preacher man in Texas, played by Dominic Cooper, who I found really, really excellent. Ruth Negga is in it. She was just in Loving. And so she's in there as the love interest. And then there's an Irish vampire named Casey who's just ridiculous. And it's having broader conversations about faith and love and relationships with God, but also the American dream and how those things are sort of in flux right now and what that means on it's a show that incorporates a lot of violence. It is not for the faint of heart. But if you can sort of get past, people getting dismembered with chainsaws, which I guess that depends on where you are on that scale, it's a really excellent show that I think is having some pretty complex conversations.
Oh, okay. Interesting. No, so I'm watching Buffy again.
Of course you are.
Of course I am, right? Because, so it was the 20th anniversary of Buffy, and I got all nostalgic, and so I started watching the first season again. You know what, guys? It's great. It's great every time, man. It's so good. It's terrible, but it's so amazing in its
The
terribleness.
fashion alone.
is enough to just
It's
warrant
the 90s, man.
Absolutely. And so we just watched the episode with the giant praying mantis last night. And
That's actually one of the few I have seen. I've watched like 3 episodes of Buffy, and that was the first one.
Get out.
I will get out and go not watch Buffy.
Oh my.
sin.
Hurt my
sin
heart.
of all.
Yeah, no, that's what it was
You're
happening
not
when I was
invited
watching
back.
No, it's interesting because Ashley and I actually were in a class about Buffy. It was a class entirely about Buffy. Then 15 weeks on Buffy. And by the time we had gone through it, we had sort of torn it to pieces and threw it up in the air and gone like, I don't know how important this show is. But there is something so quintessential about the ways that it represents the adolescent experience that, like, I can't get away from it. You know, I try and walk away and I'm like, you know what? I don't know if I ever need to watch Buffy again. And then I find myself watching it. And it's great. It's great. I love the characters. I love the show. I think it's so profound. I think it's so silly. I think it does all of these things that are just so necessary for television and for television's history that, you know, it's the best. Buffy's the best. You know, I've really enjoyed this discussion. I think we're going to wrap it up today. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter, and you can contact us by email. Soon we're going to be looking at what shows we should have on the show, what we're going to be talking about. We might do some polls and some other things like that. So look forward to that. Next week, we're going to discuss The Good Place.
Da, da, da.
This is UniversiTV. We're out.
Make sure to check us out on Facebook or Twitter by liking us at UniversiTV Podcast, or you can email us at universitytvpodcast@gmail.com with your recommendations for future episodes.